In this video, we will continue working with the getUser web service endpoint, and we will update it to make it read the user ID from the URL path parameter and return a user details back as a response. Currently, this method returns a string value, which we will need to correct. So this method will need to return user details, and we do have already user details object. We called it user rest, and it returns user details right after a new record has been recorded in our database. So if I open its declaration, it will return user ID, which is a public user ID, first name, last name, and email address. I will copy the data type of this class, and I will make our getUser return this data type. So for us to be able to get details of a specific user, we will need to know the ID of that user. And if I switch back to Postman, the request for user details should look something like this. It should be HTTP GET request. This is why in our REST controller, we create a GET mapping for the getUser method. So it should be HTTP GET request, and then it should be sent to the following URL path. Users is our request mapping for the user controller, and then /, and this ID is a public ID of a user, is a unique value which we have generated for this user, and we have stored that value in a database. This value is generated at the time when user signs up for our application and is returned back to a calling client. It could be a Postman or mobile application. At the time when user logs in, we return back a JSON web token, and we return back user ID as part of HTTP headers. So to be able to get user details of a specific user, we will need to provide user ID as a URL path parameter here. So for our code to be able to read the URL path parameter, we will need to update the getUser method and the get mapping by adding URL path variable, and it's done this way. So we'll need to update get mapping by adding path equal, and then we will need to include / and then the path parameter, and we can call it anyway. I'll call it ID like this. So by doing this, I'm creating a mapping for this method that this method should be triggered if HTTP GET request is sent to / users, but after / users, there will be another / and the value of ID. And to make this ID available to my method, I will need to create a method argument, which is of a string value. I will call it ID as well, but it should be annotated with path variable annotation. So I'll add the annotation path variable, and I will need to import it like this. So now we will be able to read the path variable, which is user ID, and make it available to our user method. And the rest of the code we already know. So we will need to return user object, user rest. So I'll paste it here, and then we will need to return that object back. But before we return this object, we will need to populate it with user details, and we will need to use user service. We have already auto-wired user service in our REST controller, and we will use user service to get user, but this time not by email. We have a function that gets user by email or username, but this time we will need to get user by its public ID. We don't have that function, so we'll need to create. So I'll create get user by user ID. I'll need to create this function. So I will send it user ID as a parameter, and that function get user by user ID will need to return a user data transfer object, user DTO, which I will then use to populate the user rest object. So I will then use beanutils, just like we used it in the create user method, beanutils, and then I will use its copy properties method to copy properties from a source object, which is user DTO, to the target object, which is our return value, like this. And this is it. Our getUser method should work. Let's just continue and implement the getUser by user ID in our service class.